In our application, we would want multiple things. Some things would be constant, like we want admin role, user role, customer role. So we need to create those roles as well as we will create initial users. Before we create the test users, we first need to complete the configuration with the identity server. When we are working with identity server, there are few terms that you should be aware of like API scope, clients, and so on. In our identity project, let me right click here and add a new class for holding all the static details. We will call this SD and this will be a static class, so that way we don't have to create any object. Now in our application, we want to make sure there are multiple roles like customer, admin, and so on. So we will create two constants here. One will be for admin, and then we will copy that and paste it for the customer role. These will be two constants. Now whatever I will be typing here, I will also attach a snippet inside the downloads folder so you can directly download and paste it here rather than typing it. But let me walk you through the configurations that we have to configure in this file for identity server. In an identity server, there are few terminology that you should be aware of. The first thing is an identity resource. Identity resource is a named group of claims that can be requested using a scope parameter. So resources will be basically something that you want to protect with your identity server, either identity data of your users or the API itself. Identity resources are data like user ID, name or email address of a user. So what will happen is an identity resource has a unique name. You can assign the arbitrary claim types to that. So basically, names will be stored in some claim types. And then when you access the identity token, all of these identity resources will be provided in some type of claim. That being said, let me create few identity resources. This will be a public static and it will be an IEnumerable because it will be a list of identity resource. You can see it is present inside the Dundee.IdentityServer namespace. We will call this as identity resources and this will be a list of identity resources. Now what are all of the identity resources we want in this particular application? First will be a new identity resource. We'll say .openid. This initializes a new instance of OpenID. Next one will be the identity resources dot, and then you can see we have few defaults here. So we will be adding email and let me also add profile. You can also add a custom identity resource if you want to add something to the claim types later on. But as I've said before, I will only help you to set up the basic identity server and understand it and not go into much details of customizing the identity server. Next thing that we have to do is we will create a scope. Scopes are basically identifiers for resource that the client wants to access. In our case, the client will be mango.webproject because that will be using identity servers to retrieve tokens. There are two types of scopes in identity server. One is identity scope and the next one is resource scope. Identity scope will have an object of the profile itself. One example is the profile will have an identity scope and that will include first name, last name, username, and so on. So right here we will say public, static, IEnumerable, and this will be of the type API scope. We will call this as API scopes. Goes to, it will be a list of API scope, and here we will just add the new API scope. We can call this anything that we want. So first will be a name that we will give, and next will be a display name. We can just call this as Mango, and name we can say Mango Server. Using the single scope that we created, we will allow users for all the operations. But if you want to go into customization, you can basically create 3 different scopes, one for read, write, and delete. And then whatever scope you want to give your client access to, based on that they will either perform read, write, or delete operation. I will not go into much details, but I do like to give a brief overview. So right here, this is how you can create more scope. You can see we have added 4 scopes here: read, write, delete, along with the Mango that we have. So here, rather than Mango, you can call this Mango Admin or whatever you prefer. Now scope will be used by a client. So we need to create the last entity here, which will be a client. And keep in mind that there can be more than one client for a specific server. So how do we create a client? That will be public static IEnumerable client. And we will call that as clients goes to, let me create a new list of client. Now that brings another terminology. A client is a piece of software that requests a token from identity server. It can be either for authenticating a user or for accessing a resource. Example of clients are web application, mobile application, desktop applications, etc. In our case, our client is mango.web project. So first let me show you how to create a generic client, and then you can create a client for mango.web. So right here with this new client, we have to provide some properties like client ID. We will call that as client. Next is client secrets. Here we will have to create a new object of the type secret, and then we need to provide the secret key. In production, obviously we will have a more secure key, but right now I'll just call that as secret. Then we have the allowed grant types. On there we have the grant types, which is a collection, and on there we will use the client credentials. After that we have one of the important factor, which is allowed scope. We have 4 scopes that we declared. Out of that, which one we want to allow here? So right here we will give it multiple scopes like read, write, and I have said before that there is a built-in scope with the name of profile, so you can add that as well. Now this is how we can create a generic client. Now let's get more specific on what we have to do to create a client for our mango.web project. Let's do that in the next video.